Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to learn about the Beatles through the book The Love You Make. It is from the experiences that Peter Brown had with the Beatles and Brian Epstein. Peter worked as Brian's personal assistant, and he was also a senior executive of Apple Corporation. Peter, according to Wikipedia, didn't want to share his experiences, but because there were so many inaccurate stories floating around in 1979, he agreed to write his recollections down. Peter got in touch with all the Beatles, and they each agreed that it was a good idea to do a definitive book once and for all and get it all over with, and then they could forget about it. Some say that Peter's book is a kiss and tell one, and let's dive in now and see if that's true. The preface of the book said the Beatles came across as real, recognizable people. The Beatles aren't written as saints, and Peter wrote the book with Stephen Gaines. They said that John Lennon gave his blessings. Yoko was gracious and helpful and gave direct interviews. Paul and Linda gave their time and trust. George Harrison invited them to his Friar Park estate and gave an open interview. Neil Aspinall, Maureen Starkey, Ringo's first wife, Patty Harrison, George's first wife, Magic Alex, and Cynthia Lennon also contributed. So I'll go throughout the book and see what new information we may not have heard about before or something we may need reminding of. The first chapter deals with Cynthia Lennon returning home from a 2-week Greece vacation in May of 1968 and finding John and Yoko having breakfast in their bathrobes. Cynthia didn't know what to say. She felt the moment was so casual and so cruel. Cynthia had been on holiday with Jenny Boyd, who is Patty Boyd's sister, and Magic Alex had been there too. When they entered the house, it was weirdly quiet. The drapes were drawn and the lights were off. Cynthia went to the staircase and called out for anyone. Is anyone home? No answer. So she went through the living room and sunroom, and Cynthia thought she heard a noise from the kitchen. John was in a dressing gown, drinking a hot tea in his left hand and a lighted Lark cigarette in his right. Yoko was at the kitchen table, her back to the door. She didn't turn around to face Cynthia. The kitchen was a mess, and the housekeeper didn't seem to be around for a few days. John just said, "Oh, hi," and sipped on his tea, and Cynthia looked into his eyes and could see he was stoned. Then Yoko turned her chair around and looked at her. She was 8 years older than John, unsmiling. She was married and had a 6-year-old daughter, and she was in Cynthia's bathrobe. And Yoko said the same thing as John. "Oh, hi." Cynthia pretended that nothing unusual was going on and asked them if they wanted to go out to dinner. She asked John if he was going, and he said, "No, thanks." So then Cynthia turned and ran from the kitchen. She gathered things to pack, and Jenny and Magic Alex were in the front hall, and then they left. Cynthia knew the marriage didn't have a chance from the beginning. John always struggled with his problems, and she was never able to ease his mind. The last few years she watched him as he got into drugs. At 28, he was mostly a drug addict. He was high and drunk almost every day of his life since Cynthia had met him. Cynthia said that John would go on acid binges, and he would do that for weeks on end until he didn't see color anymore but black and white. So that would be scary. And Cynthia said their relationship ended the moment he started doing marijuana and LSD. Cynthia was stunned when she found out that Yoko was the one with him. Cynthia knew that women were after him for his money or fame. There were the sleazy groupies, movie stars, and writers. A few weeks before Cynthia had walked in on John and Yoko, he had confessed marital affairs to her, some she never suspected. He said his conquests were Joan Baez, the English actress Eleanor Braun, who was in the movie Help, Evening Standard journalist Maureen Cleave, and pop singer Jackie DeShannon. Also, he slept with 300 other girls in towns and cities around the world. None of them captured his attention except Yoko. She never gave up trying to get him. It was like an obsession. He met her at an art exhibit, and then she tried to get her hooks in him. Cynthia thought it was a mistake to support Yoko's art and give her money, and she kept coming back for more. Yoko would show up at the Apple offices and ask to speak to him. They told her he wasn't at the office very much. She then tried to flirt with Neil Aspinall, who was the Beatles' loyal friend, and he rejected her. Then she tried Ringo Starr, but he couldn't understand a word she was talking about and got away from her. The security guard said that she was part of the fence, and one time she said she was going to chain herself to the fence in order to see John. And this is the time John should have done a Ringo and got away from her. Then Yoko focused on John's house. She started to call him frequently. John had to change his number 3 or 4 times. Yoko also sent him dozens of letters, and the letters asked and then demanded that he support. Cynthia interceded some of the letters, and she saved them when they turned dark and despairing in case Yoko ever tried to kill herself, as she said she would. When she was in Japan, she tried to kill herself, and Cynthia said one letter said, "I can't carry on. You're my last hope. If you don't support me, that's it. I'll kill myself." So Yoko then started to go to the house. She waited in the driveway for John to come or go. She would be there from early in the morning till late at night. It didn't matter about the weather. And the housekeeper was afraid to go near her. Cynthia's mother felt sorry for her and let her come in the house to have some water and make a phone call. Yoko left a ring there so she would have an excuse to be there the next day, and she wanted to be inside. Yoko sent a package one day, and when Cynthia and her mother opened it, it had a Kotex box, and Yoko buried a broken china cup painted blood red. And John thought it was funny. Cynthia and her mother didn't. After a while, Cynthia got tired of all of Yoko's nonsense and said to John, "Maybe Yoko's the one for you." And John laughed and said, "Her? She's daft. She's not one for me. She's amusing, is all. I don't fancy her." Cynthia had made a promise that she would never desert John no matter how bad he was to her. She thought her and John were destined to be together, and she felt they would be together until death, and then for eternity. At the time the book was published in 1982, she felt that same way. And after finding John and Yoko, Cynthia was starting to lose faith. And that night, Cynthia and Magic Alex drank a lot of wine, and she ended up sleeping with Alex, who was John's best friend. It was her way of symbolically ending her relationship with John forever. When she met him at art college, she was leery of him, but his guitar drew her to him. And one day in the noisy basement dining hall of the art college, she saw a small group of students forming around the stage at the end of the cafeteria. John was sitting on the stage apron playing his guitar and singing. He was singing "Ain't She Sweet," and all his anger was gone, and she just stood and listened. John at primary school, well, he was a quick study at school, but John got bored easily. He had a mean sense of humor. He wasn't interested in the schoolwork. He drew satirical cartoons about his teachers and classmates, along with poems and short stories filled with puns. Mimi encouraged him to read, and she got him books from the local library. Wind in the Willows, he loved to read poetry, and Lewis Carroll's nonsense poem, Jabberwocky Through the Looking Glass. He also liked the Jess Williams children's books. When he got in his teens, he was a handful. He would torture luckless neighborhood girls by grabbing their panties and pulling them down to their ankles. A teacher wrote in his report, "He's just wasting other people's time." Mimi was beside herself. She ruled the house, but she couldn't have a grip on John. All kinds of punishments, but it didn't affect him. She was disturbed by him stealing money from her purse. She beat him, but it didn't make him stop. And then John and Paul started to be friends. There was a 2-year difference between them, but they had so many similarities and interests. Personality-wise, they were very different. Paul was self-righteous, conscientious, and listened to his elders. John defied authority, he was immoral, and he liked to be the outsider. John and Paul would play hooky from school, and they practiced songs, taught each other chords, and ate jam buddies. One day, Paul played John a song he had written, and John improvised one on the spot to show he could do it too. And they wrote over 100 songs the first year. John found it easy to compose the beginning melody for a song, but got stuck for a transition and a break, and Paul liked to write the middle eights. When Paul joined the Quarrymen, he had things to say about the music. He started to tell the other band members how to play and when, and he also wanted to play the lead guitar. So all this didn't go over well with the band members, and 2 of them left. Cynthia was a little possessive, too. John seemed to like clingy women. Cynthia, when she first started going out with him, would meet up with him every chance she got. She paid for his cigarettes and coffee and never got tired of hanging out with him at his favorite hangout, the Jacaranda. She would hold his hand under the formica table and stare into his eyes for hours while he told her the story of his life. The stage there was small, and there were featured strippers and sex shows. The customers were gangsters, drug pushers, and transvestites, and they weren't too happy to see the Beatles. The Beatles were to entertain from 7 in the evening to 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes 7 days a week. The club owner gave them a place to stay. The theater played porn films with gangster movies. They got clean blankets and bedding, but not towels, and the only toilet was a public one at the rear of the theater. For 5 months, they only had a sponge bath. Their meals were a bowl of cornflakes and milk, and they ate what they had when they woke up in the afternoon. And then they had an occasional dinner at the Seamen's Mission. The dressing room was also the men's toilets. An attendant named Rosa sold them a supply of German-made diet pills called Preluden, and she kept them in a candy jar. Pete Best didn't take the pills, and the Beatles felt they needed the Prellies to keep them going. The pills made them thirsty, and they kept drinking the free beer. Customers would also send up beers to keep them playing. Pete Best kept on the straight and narrow, and the other Beatles liked the red light district. They didn't have to pay for sex very often because they were cute and young. And they had barmaids and customers. They ended up with venereal diseases. They would go to the public health facilities in Hamburg, which were free, and get cured, only to become stricken down again. When they got back to Liverpool, they got cleaned up. And when they finally returned home, George had to go first because he was under 18. Paul and Pete got into trouble and had to go home when Paul lit up a prophylactic on the wall, and it caught fire, and the drapes beside the wall caught on fire. Stu and John were the only ones left, and they headed home. And John returned by train, Stu by plane since he was sick. When John got home in the middle of the night, he threw rocks at the window to wake Mimi up. When she answered the door, John pushed past her and said, "Pay the taxi, Mimi." She asked, "Where's your £100 a week, John?" John had said to her that they were going to make big money there, and he promised her large savings at the end of the Hamburg trip. He turned and sighed and said, "Just like you, Mimi, to go on and on about £100 a week when you know I'm tired." So in this video, we got to see just how determined Yoko was to have John supply her money and support her art exhibits. And I'm surprised they didn't get a restraining order on her. She really was over the top in her pursuit of him. Cynthia was possessive of John when she was dating him, but she didn't go to the extremes that Yoko did. Then we got to see the differences between John and Paul in the young days. And we also got to see how rough it was in Hamburg during the early Beatle days. But they didn't let their horrible living conditions stop them from performing for the crowd. Things didn't end up great when they had to go home, but they kept on going. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, if you could give the video a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. Tune in for more about the Beatles from Peter Brown's Remembrances. It should be informative. Thank you, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Bye.